Hey there, Bixby developers. Today we're continuing part 2 of the Input View tutorial 2021. So continuing from where we left off, this is the capsule that we had so far.
What is your name?
Jonathan.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Jonathan. What is your email address? Here's what I found.
So far we've only completed 2 input views for collecting a name and an email. And the email one, has some type of validation in it. Today we're going to continue on this to finish this capsule. And we'll see if we can finish it in one video, or maybe we'll have to do a part 3, but there's only one way to find out, and that's to continue working on this. If you recall from the first video where I showcased this capsule, we began to collect some time-related stuff. And we're going to be creating the started and the duration collections for this capsule. And the first thing we need to do is to actually import the time library, but we may as well actually just, update this part and to kind of get rid of some of the errors and stuff. And last but not least is what we actually came here for, and that is the capsule imports. So we're going to need to import the viv.time library. And this viv.time library allows us to basically use a lot of time-related Bixby functions, and it makes it a lot easier for us to deal with time. Now, in case you're curious on how to find the most recent version number, go to bixbydevelopers.com and just search library, and you go to library capsules. And if we go here, we can see the most updated versions for these library capsules, and you're going to want to generally use the most updated version for your capsule. Next, let's actually create our time concepts. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to add when you started using Bixby as a question, as well as when do you plan to build something for Bixby. And both of these are going to be structured, but we'll actually create them one at a time. The first one being the started model. And what we're going to do with this structure is to actually give it a role of. And we're going to need the role of time.date right here. And what this does is that it basically makes this structure to copy whatever the structure time.date is. And it's a very easy way to utilize some predefined structures that we have in the time library. And we need to do the same thing for the duration, which is going to be, the question of when do you plan to build something for Bixby. We'll just delete this and we'll do role of time.date interval. And this will allow you to collect basically a date interval from, this date to whatever date. So as with this capsule, we want to add these as inputs as well. And we're going to have started, and we're going to have duration. These ones match the 2 concepts that we just created. And next in the JavaScript, we also want to add started and duration. And since this capsule is pretty simple, we will just spit those back to the user. And last but not least, we need to update our endpoints file as well. Great, so let's go ahead and start the capsule.
What is your name?
And if we take a look at the debugger, we can see that here we have 3 required inputs. We are currently on the input of name, but we can see how it's also going to require the duration and started as well. That's one way to verify that it's working. And let's actually get started with started first by creating a new view file for it. And this will be an input view. So we're just going to go ahead and select all that and remove it, change it to an input view. We want to match the concept started. We'll present a message, when did you start using Bixby? And we're going to have the render, and this is actually going to be a different thing than, for example, this, where we use this form with elements for the email as an example. For this one, we have a specific input view component called the date picker, which is perfect for picking, a date, a single date. And here, in order to basically have this date picker start on today, as an example, you can use the now.date. We're going to add some restrictions as well. So the minimum allowed here is basically, I believe it is now.day subtract 3,650 days from now.day. So this goes back by about 10 years or so, which is the minimum allowed date here. And similarly, we can do a max allowed, where instead of 3,650 days ago, we now have 0 days ago. So in other words, the highest date into the future, or I guess now that we're allowing for this capsule, is today. Because obviously you can't have started using Bixby, in the future if you're using Bixby to answer this question today. And finally, we can just have the submit button and put whatever text you want as the submit button. Right here, I'm just going to have the text submit. Let's go ahead and see if that works.
When did you start using Bixby?
And now we can see that we're able to go through here, and we can see that there is a 10-year limit, and we also can't go into the future. Here you can see November 11th, which is when I filmed this video. And if we select, let's just say I started using Bixby November 5th.
I need a duration to continue.
And it actually auto-generated this duration calendar, which is really interesting, but we'll have to customize it a bit.
Here's what I found.
It does look like we forgot to add this into the structure for the entire survey. So going back to that, why don't we go ahead and add this to the survey? And these will both be required, max 1 as well, and then it will show on the last screen as well.
Here's what I found.
And there we go. You can see how we successfully added these two into the structure object, which is what's returned back to the user at the end. Okay, so now that we've added the ability to use the UI in order to determine a date, we also want to add some training examples for that. Going over to the training, we can just click add, for example, November 10th, 2021, and we can select this and set it as a time.date. And the goal will be, of course, for the started, because that is the one we're working on, and add prompt for started. Go ahead and try that out.
When did you start using Bixby?
So now we can say, for example, October 10th, 2020.
I need a duration to continue. Here's what I found.
And we can see here that it did indeed work, and it took October 10th, 2020. Now, there are a lot more training examples that I would recommend adding as well. Like, for example, we can try, for example, yesterday. And we can set this as a time.date. So just like the previous training example, started, at prompt for started, and this should allow us to say yesterday as well in order to answer this question. All right, great. So now let's go ahead and work on the duration portion, which is the date interval. And we basically have most of it done already, but we're going to need to add a view for it, as well as some training examples for it. So let's go ahead and start with the view. It's going to be duration.view.bxb, and it's going to be an input view. It's going to match the duration, and we're going to render. And in this case, we are rendering a calendar input view component. The initial value will be very similar to the previous one, which is now.date. And we will allow a range. And finally, we're going to add the restriction of block past dates. So because the question is, when do you plan to build for Bixby? I guess we can add a message. When are you planning to build something for Bixby? Kind of a question of, for the future, but I guess you could let it not block past dates by just putting false here, but for this example, we'll have that. Let's go ahead and try that out now.
When are you planning to build something for Bixby?
Oh yeah, and here we can see that I had allow range is false, so we're only able to select a single day at the moment. That's fine, but we're going to change that to true. But for this, right now, we'll just keep going.
Here's what I found.
There we go. But let's change that to true, and now you're able to select a date range instead of just a single date. But of course, last but not least for this, we will want to add a training example for it. And in this case, I'm just going to do from, let's say, November 20th to December 1st. The training for this should be time.date interval. And this will be the duration at prompt for duration as well. So you guys probably are getting the drill at this point. Go ahead and try that out. From December 3rd to December 25th.
When are you planning to build something for Bixby?
Okay, and here we can see that this training example didn't quite work. And it's actually because you need to tag the from as well. So all we have to do is scoot this over into the parentheses by aligning the NL. And this will also flag the from as well. So let's go ahead and try that. From December 3rd to December 30th.
When are you planning to build something for Bixby? When are you planning to build something for Bixby?
You'll see that it's actually stuck in an endless loop. And what's actually going on here is that it can't quite figure out which exact November 20th and December 1st you are referring to. This could be, this year's November 1st to December, or it could be next year's or whatever, right? So it's actually pretty confusing. But what we can kind of do is we can just assume that the first one is the one that we're looking for. And we can see that this first one is November 20th of 2021 to December 1st of 2021, and that's looking pretty good. Now, of course, this may not apply to every single capsule that, you work with, especially when it comes to time. But for this one and for this tutorial, it's honestly good enough. So what we actually need to do is we need to go back to the action and do a default select with rule of select first. And what this ends up doing is that it just selects the first out of the 3 potential date ranges that you provided it.
When are you planning to build something for Bixby?
And I'm going to change these back to required. I just made them optional for now for testing purposes. But now if we go start
What is your name?
And we go through everything.
It's a pleasure to meet you, George. When did you start using Bixby? When are you planning to build something for Bixby? Here's what I found.
And there we go. Now finally the duration is properly working. So time is definitely something that's pretty messy to work with in input views, or honestly just with anything in code. But the time library does make this a lot easier to use. And if you can figure out, some of the caveats with it, as well as particularities, like needing this default select first in this situation when it comes to ambiguous time frames that, Bixby could interpret. So yeah, in the next video, we'll wrap this up. It looks like this is going to be a 3-parter, but we're going to be doing a couple simple components and then finally building the result view around, making the survey look a bit more presentable to the end user. And yeah, that's it.